For over 25 years, John Branson was one of the most prominent people in Westport. As rector of Christ Holy Trinity Episcopal Church, he was a religious leader, a conscience of the community, and even because of the church's location, a force for downtown. After retiring in 2012 and having a beautiful meeting hall named for him that's used now regularly by plenty of non-religious groups, Reverend Branson and his wife Judith retired to North Carolina. But he was called back as interim rector by churches in Illinois, North Carolina, Virginia, and then Greenwich. Now the Bransons are back in Westport. It's my honor to welcome Reverend John Branson to 06880, the podcast.
Thank you, Dan. It's good to be here today.
I'm always fascinated by people's career paths, particularly clergy. So are you the type of person who always said, I always want to be a minister, or are you the one that they say, oh my God, I can't believe he's a minister?
I'm probably the second, as a matter of fact. I was raised in the Episcopal Church, so I was, shall we say, weaned, nurtured by the church, and one of the classic examples back in the post-World War II era, baptized into the church and then became, of course, a choir boy in that particular church, and then an acolyte when my voice changed. I ended up going to an Episcopal boarding school, so I was thoroughly steeped in the Anglican or the Episcopal ethos, if you will. And then after college, I went actually to a small Presbyterian college, and I'm old enough so that that particular college required chapel 2 days a week, as it was established by a number of Presbyterian ministers many years ago. So I certainly had my fill of church, and as I remember some classmates of mine saying they had enough church, they had banked enough church to last them a lifetime, and the only time they would ever go to church again was for a wedding or a funeral. But for me, it was something had sparked my imagination with that quest for the holy, for the mystical, for that which was the creation of all things, the creator of all things, intrigued by creation, and so I wanted to pursue it. I wanted to really dive into it. So I ended up majoring in religion in college, as a matter of fact, and then unlike many others who go out into the world to have some life experience, fortunately or unfortunately, I jumped right into divinity school after that to continue my quest, if you will. In those days, I used to speak of it as the quest for the golden fleece, feeling as if I was one of the Argonauts, for example, that I was out to grab something that was out there that I didn't know what it was exactly. And so that's being very self-oriented. Later on, I came to the realization, at least this is the way I see it, is that it wasn't so much my going out and grabbing something, it's rather God calling me to all of the endeavors I've been engaged with through the course of my life. So it was both my own quest, that classic quest going out into the world to find that elusive whatever, but also at the same time I would say that it was God calling me all this while. So,
did you find it?
I have. And in some respects, I had another one of those aha moments. My second year of seminary or divinity school, I was working in a small blue-collar parish in Waterbury, Connecticut, and had been not the most diligent complier with expectations of that particular congregation. I have an awful memory. This is so embarrassing for me. But in the Episcopal Church, there is a hierarchy, not only of the clergy, but also within the congregation, the lay persons who are the mainstay of the congregation, quite honestly. And one of we call them in the Episcopal Church wardens, as other churches have different nomenclature for that. But this particular warden wanted to take me out to lunch. And the first time he invited me, I completely forgot about it and essentially blew him off, as they say. He invited me. He was a little bit stirred up about that. And another time, on another occasion, he invited me to lunch. And this is true. I again forgot the invitation. I mean, that's very more than unkind. That's unconscionable. But in fact, I did it a third time, if you can imagine that. And so I think he was fairly disgusted with me, appropriately, understandably. But I was never, that experience in my life, I had a chance to really learn some forgiveness, self-forgiveness, if you will, and trying to figure out why I did that. I think there was some, quite honestly, overt resistance because he had taken me aside when he first interviewed me and indicated to me that he was saying to me that I should never preach about the war in Vietnam. In those days, this was the 70s, and again, the church and many synagogues and many religious organizations were so much caught up in that fervor. And I think I really held, I was really angry at him, annoyed at him. And so this is my unconscious way of paying it back, so to speak. But it took me some time to really think seriously and long about that experience and to learn some self-forgiveness. But it was in that setting, in this blue-collar parish, that in a sense the light bulb came on for me, or I could see God's light illuminating my way. And it was there that I really fell in love with parish ministry. The opportunities to make horrible mistakes, as I did, but also to seek the forgiveness of that person and other members of the congregation, the clergy, that sort of thing. But the breadth of the experience from birth to death, and to be invited, it is such a privilege to be invited into the lives of folk who are oftentimes in crisis, going through some of the most difficult and awkward times in their lives, whether it be the occasion of the death of a child, the death of a spouse, the death of a parent, or grave illness, going to a hospital to be with people where the medical profession is doing their thing, but there's the discovery of another dimension that's happening, especially when we're most vulnerable. If we're lying flat on our back, for example, in a hospital bed, that stirs up or can stir up for any number of us many, many things. And it's such a privilege to be able to speak with people about that experience, about their perspective, to pray with them, to listen to their fears, their anxieties, their sorrows. And again, maybe on my deathbed, for example, I will speak about that ridiculous experience of refusing or blowing off lunch if you will, 3 times, and seeking God's forgiveness for that. And this particular fellow, who clearly is no longer alive, but I never fully reconciled with him. Wow. But being a person who can be in those very tempered places where we sometimes call them the thin places, where we are in deep connection with God. We in the church and religious institutions talk about that, the thinness, going out into nature, for example, and seeing something we've never seen before that just so stirs our souls and lifts us up. So it's just it's a privilege to focus one's self, one's writing, one's reading, one's whole self onto those very, very special places in our lives.
And what's it like, or what was it like to do it in a place like Westport? You know, where there's so much going on, and it's not always, people don't have time for those sorts of reflections.
Right. It's a challenge. Because people are as busy as they are, and because they have opportunities that many others don't have. And what we're speaking of here is perhaps a beach house or a ski house, or it's just part and parcel of their lives to travel, both for business but also vacation. So they are caught up in mechanisms, if you will, that are both healthy and fruitful and bountiful and blessings for their family. But at the same time, those tensions and pressures create friction. We can't always do all that we want to do, both in business and in pleasure seeking. And there are those friction places. And so I think the clergy here in Westport in particular are invited into those friction places where we oftentimes are most vulnerable. And it's such a privilege to be part of those lives. So in the beginning, I think I was perhaps disappointed or not so much frustrated, but I had to learn that this was the way it is. Nevertheless, there is still folk in Westport and the surrounding areas are just as vulnerable, just as prone to crisis, prone to issues when a parent dies or whatever it happens to be. A child is, for example, seriously injured in a skiing accident, or certainly in Westport, I mean, there are numerous stories of children being injured in some of the athletic endeavors that Westport is in part renowned for. But that, again, creates vulnerability and a crisis moment in families' lives. And so it's a privilege, again, to be able to be called in. Some people are not so deeply connected to whether it be a church or a synagogue, but we're here. And again, in the old days, churches like Christ Holy Trinity, for example, created steeples. And one of the architectural points is that it makes it visible to the town. And so even though folk may not be specific members of a particular faith community, nevertheless, we're here. And I think the town knows that very well. And when there are occasions like 9/11 or some sort of national crisis or international crisis, or situations, whether it be pandemics, that sort of thing, the church really steps up, just the same way that there are so many other professionals in town here who step up and step in those moments when we find ourselves fearful, bewildered, feeling betrayed perhaps, whatever it might be. But there are so many wonderful, gifted, well-educated, well-trained people to step in and be a support system.
The Episcopal Church has really changed and evolved over the last few decades. Can you talk about how the church in Westport especially has changed?
Sure. In some respects, the church is still doing, that is, acting on its faith and working in the world in a particular sort of way. So one of the things that happens in Westport in particular, I think, is the living out of one's faith. In other words, it's not just in a synagogue or in a church on a Sunday morning or Saturday. It's rather offering that love, that relationship to others in the world who don't have it. One of the things that holds us fast in the Episcopal Church is our liturgy. It's been recognized by many, many people around the world as being one of the constants in our lives, as far as how we pray, how we sing, our particular orientation, both to God, but also to one another, and then to people outside the church. So the liturgy is very, very important to us. But over the course of time, that liturgy, the way we say our prayers, the words we use, that has changed considerably. You will see or you will feel and hear vestiges in our lives as we worship that go back to the beginnings for us as Episcopalians, back into the middle of the 16th century. So you can find direct contacts or some of the words, as a matter of fact, or a particular orientation when we worship that is still as strong as ever. And yet at the same time, there is very much a realization that the world has changed dramatically. And so there are many more churches and synagogues oriented now, for example, to the environment, to what's happening in our larger world, and how each one of us are somehow accountable to that. And so there are movements, certainly within the Episcopal Church, and I should say every church, quite honestly, every church, where the movements are to address world issues, national issues, poverty, lack of education, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the list goes on and on. But when we came to Westport in 1991, specifically Christ Holy Trinity was a church pretty set in its ways, and that's understandable since the previous rector had been the rector for almost 30 years there. And so we, again, as people, we fall back into our habits. We fall back into ways of doing things that are comfortable, in fact, oftentimes easy. So we would say that when we came in 1991, there was a pretty dramatic change or transformation that needed to take place, that did take place by the grace of God and by the wonderful support of lots and lots of people who came to the church kind of looking, intrigued, again, just the same way that I, as a young man, went out looking. Again, the churches and religious organizations and institutions are here for those seekers, we call them. But we also know today that we can't just remain back in our little hovels, if you will. They're not hovels, of course, but our sacred sanctuaries. We need to go out into the world and speak the truth in love and live the truth in love, as a matter of fact. So there has been any number of changes. Again, there's a constancy, but at the same time, there's been, tremendous transformation.
Is there a particular transformation or change that you can point to, that you can say, this is why I do what I do or did what I did?
I think I was, though I did not participate as a board member, I don't believe I was ever on the board of what is now called Homes with Hope. But the origins of that endeavor, coming up out of the hearts and souls of some very talented, gifted people who were really concerned about the homeless, about the least and the lost. We can talk about Pete Powell, of course. We can talk about Ted Hoskins. We can talk about some of the work that was done at Temple Israel, and Bob Orkand. There was just leadership amongst the religious community here in Westport that said, we need to do something in light of, again, what many people considered a problem, and most of us, or many of us, might speak of it that way. It was not a problem, it was rather an opportunity. And thanks be to God that so many wonderful people over the course of time have really stepped up. So that is one of those transformational moments for me. I have to confess that I was probably more deeply engaged in the changing or the transformation of Christ Holy Trinity Church in those days. I was more fixated on that than the wider community in those days at that particular time. But I watched, I saw, I listened, and I was moved by those that did, those that could, and look what we have today. It's quite amazing.
You've mentioned a lot the other ministers, the rabbis, and it's really called, it has a name, the Interfaith Clergy.
Yes.
So what were those meetings like? Would you sit around and debate theology or what?
Actually not. That would be boring, although we did have some sessions where we did set aside specifically time to look at Scripture, the way we read Scripture, interpret Scripture, which has so much to do with being people of faith. We read the Scriptures, both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, very differently, and that's certainly true in the wider church in the United States. So we would set aside some time for listening, for some instruction. Those that knew a little bit more about they may have had some education in the past related to this. So we did that. But the meetings more especially were discerning. It's too overt to say discerning what God was calling us to do. But what's cooking in your faith community? What are the themes, the issues? What are the struggles? And how can we learn from each other? What is it that you're doing at maybe Temple Israel, for example, that is working well for a particular segment of the community? And how might a Christian adopt some of those same practices or platforms along those lines? We certainly worked on being as collegial as we possibly could. And when I say working on that, there are occasions, no matter who we are, where it's appropriate to come together like a Thanksgiving, like the time of Thanksgiving, and to give honor and respect to our predecessors, and also to lay down some themes and ideas in a particular way that our children and grandchildren will pick up and carry on in the ways we have done. And so whether it be civic events or national religious events, it's a way to honor each other's traditions and practices as well. So those meetings were very fruitful. We had some fun, we had some laughter, and I will say that as one who was not the head pastor or priest or rabbi of a faith community during the COVID time, I was essentially sitting in other people's pews in those days. The responsibility and the challenge of leadership in those days across the board, not only in Westport, but just around the world, and certainly throughout the United States, is so extraordinary. It was such a challenge to be able to lead, especially when we couldn't be together, be a family of faith. We couldn't meet with one another, and that's so much of who we really are, to pray together, to sing together, and not able to do that. How does one create, if you will, or support community in such a difficult time? So again, technology has been a boon, but it's also like many things, it's a steep learning curve too.
So now that you spent 20 years in Westport, then you became an itinerant interim rector.
Yes.
Do you have a different perspective on Westport as a community and as a faith community?
It would be too early for me to say anything about being the faith community. Again, Judith and I, my wife Judith, we were away 10 years, and we moved down to a community just outside of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which we enjoyed immensely because of the presence of the university in large part, but not only. North Carolina being a very mixed up state. But coming back to Westport after 10 years, we have sensed a stirred up energy in town. Again, through the COVID time, as many people moved into this community away from more urban centers, seeking education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We find it, I don't mean to be harsh, but it's a bit more amped up, if you will. I mean, certainly...
And the bar was high already for
yes,
amplitude.
And the bar was high already. But just, one's journey down the post road, for example, just gives you some sense of that as the architecture is changing. And I'm not suggesting it's bad or good. It's changing. And again, oftentimes we like to think of Westport, or many of us, and I certainly put myself in that category, having been around Westport for 20 years and then leaving and then coming back, one tends to yearn for the way it used to be. But that can't be. So it's ever changing, and there's a particular, shall we say, we talk about tensile strength, but there's a particular dynamic or energy that is palpable in this town. I mean, and I think it's the result of the intellectual firepower, the creativity, the imagination, with all of the arts, and the talent, and the way people who are passionate about various pursuits have the wherewithal to go for it, and they make it happen. Whether it be theater, whether it be dance, whether it be in architecture, whatever it happens to be. But it's potent. It's potent,
and you can sense that now that you're back.
Yes, yes.
So what's your go-to place here, or go-to places?
Well, that's interesting. I found the library. It's become a go-to. I was coming back. My jaw dropped. Every time I look at the weekly journal entries of what's happening at the library, I'm amazed. For example, I came over last week to some fabulous shorts, some short movies. Yeah, Shortcuts.
Film Festival.
The film festival. Terrific. And the next night, my goodness, Billy Collins was sitting here and regaling the audience with his poetry, which is so brilliant. And he's he's almost a Mark Twain type, or he's so gifted and so brilliant. And so the fact that the library can host such significant resources, just like two nights back to back, for example. So the library has become a real resource. And again, it's always, as many people would say, the beach. Yeah. Just the beauty, the changing of the seasons. And so the beach has become, is such a blessing to so many. And I've found that one of the great resources here in Westport.
Great. Last question, back to religion. Someone is considering becoming a priest or a rabbi in Westport. They want your advice. What do you tell them?
Excellent question. I would say that I would hope they would find, and I don't mean to project myself onto them, but to create the space as you possibly can, take the time to really meditate and think deeply about this call, or these urgings that are calling you to serve God as you understand God, and to serve the people of God as well. Know that religion these days is very different from what it was in the 1950s, for example. And no one of us knows where it's all going, and how these houses of worship and churches and synagogues will unfold in the next decade or so. It will be more difficult than it's been in the past in some respects. But I would certainly encourage them to keep their prayer life alive. Again, talk to people who go deep with people, ask the deeper questions, see what moves you in your heart of hearts. The resources for your continuing education are readily available. And fortunately for many institutions, others are giving back to them, making it even more possible economically to go on to higher education in that regard. So do think about it. We need people who are deep, who are thoughtful, who are loving, caring for God and caring for God's people. So.
Perfect.
Okay.
Reverend John Branson, welcome back to Westport, and thank you for being on 06880, the podcast.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it very much.
You bet.